to go up on Thursday night and weigh in, and the weight class that he was assigned was a weight class that was a little bit lower than his natural weight. He weighs about 107, 108 pounds naturally, and he had to weigh in no more than 102.9 pounds on the dot. And so if you've never seen my children, they don't have a lot of fat on them. And so we said, hey, let's take our time losing this weight. And the way that we encouraged him to do that was by cutting out the snacking. Snacking is a favorite pastime in the Stevens household. We do it like true champions at my place. And so Denise and I found ourselves all week long sort of just saying again and again, Ty, put down the cookies, bud. Walk away from the chip bag. Put down the icy pops, right? But I have to admit that I spoke those words of challenge to him quite hypocritically. Because at one point I recall sitting down on the couch after having told him he could not have a snack and downing half a box of Oreos right in front of him. Oh, by the way, at the time we were watching a show about guys who were dropped off in the woods with no food, and so I felt like a real hypocrite at that moment. Well, don't you love those kinds of instructions in your life? The do as I say, not as I do kind of instructions. Probably we've all received those, and let's be honest, we've probably all given those sort of exhortations. Well, thankfully, friends, that is not the Apostle Paul, at least at this particular point in our letter, with the last exhortation that he has given us. You'll remember that in chapter 8, where we were last week, Paul's exhortation to the Corinthians was asking them, challenging them to willfully lay down their rights for the good of others. You remember that? They had written him a letter. They had all kinds of questions, very specific, practical, pragmatic questions. And one of those questions is, hey, Paul, what about this deal with meat that has been sacrificed to a false god? Should we eat that meat? If we eat it, are we somehow being complicit in that idolatry? Or maybe at best, are we condoning those who are doing it and communicating a false message? Or what about on the other side of the argument? If we don't eat, are we somehow refusing to live out our good rights in Christ? Are we sort of denying the fruits of our gospel freedom? And so Paul taught them, right? First of all, he taught them, he affirmed their good theology. You remember that? He says, look, you guys are absolutely right. Those are no gods at all, right? They're at least not in the sense that the Greeks believe them. They might have some demonic activity behind them, but they're no gods at all. So that meat isn't defiled. And if you eat it, you're not going to be defiled. You guys are absolutely right. And yet, he qualified their freedom to do so by saying, take care that this right of yours does not somehow become a stumbling block to the weak. In other words, you guys can eat this meat, but if you do so and it makes your brother stumble, that's not a good thing. And I'm going to challenge you, filtered through humility and love, grounded in the gospel. You guys ought to refrain from eating for the good of your brother and the building of God's church. And we talked about this a bit last week because the reality is that's not something specifically that we deal with in our context, and yet this principle of filtered Christian freedom that is driven by humility and love and grounded in the gospel is something that we deal with every day in different ways in our context. And I hope you guys have had some great conversations and kind of just really thought about what that looks like in your life. Well, today, Paul is really going to extend this argument a little bit, and to drive home this point of self-denial in the life of the Christian, he's going to use himself as a prime example of what it looks like. All right, so let's just read. I'm going to read all of chapter 9. We're not going to get through the whole thing today. We'll finish it up next week, but I'm going to read it all just to kind of set the context. 1 Corinthians chapter 9. Paul writes, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are not you my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I'm not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. This is my defense to those who would examine me. Do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who have no right to refrain from working for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating any of its fruit, or tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the same? For it is written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it the oxen that God is concerned? For he does he not speak entirely for our sake? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope, and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. If we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? And if others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right. But we have endured anything rather than put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. And do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? In the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. But I have made no use of any of these rights, nor am I writing these things to secure any such provision, for I would rather die than have anyone deprive me of my ground of boasting. For if I preach the gospel, that gives me no ground for boasting, for necessity is laid upon me. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. For if I do this of my own will, I have a reward, but if not of my own will, I am still entrusted with a stewardship. What then is my reward? That in my preaching I may present the gospel free of charge, so as not to make full use of my right in the gospel. For though I am free from all, I have made myself a servant to all, that I might win more of them. To the Jews I became a Jew in order to win Jews. To those under the law I became as one under the law, though not being myself under the law, that I might win those under the law. To those outside the law I became as one outside the law, not being outside the law, but under the law of Christ, that I might win those outside the law. To the weak I became weak, that I might win the weak. I have become all things to all people, that by all means I might save some. I do it all for the sake of the gospel, that I may share with them in its blessings. Now, do you not know that in a race all the runners run, but only one receives the prize? So run that you may obtain it. Every athlete exercises self-control in all things. They do it to receive a perishable wreath, but we an imperishable. So I do not run aimlessly. I don't box as one beating the air, but I discipline my body and I keep it under control, lest after preaching to others, I myself should be disqualified. Let's pray. God, thank you for this word. Speak it to our hearts, God. I pray you do so in spite of the weaknesses of the messenger. God, I pray that we will not just be hearers of the word today, but doers of the word as we leave this place. We pray in the name of Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen. Amen. When the book of Acts, we kind of had the story of the early church, the birth of the church. And in that story, we meet a young man named Saul. He is a zealous Jew, to say the least. And he is constrained in his very soul to do anything and everything in his power to squelch the message of this man named Jesus and his followers. Saul was the organizer of the first great persecution of the church. He sat there and held the garments in full approval as the first Christian martyr died, Stephen. But when we get to Acts chapter 9, something amazing happens. Saul was blinded so that he could actually see. And on the road there to Damascus, going to persecute Christians, Saul was saved by this Jesus he wished to erase. And in that moment, he once again became constrained, once again consumed with passion, but this time not to destroy the gospel, but to advance it at all cost. And that is the whole of the rest of the life of Paul until he lost his life by way of execution. His life was lived for the sake of the gospel. Friends, that's what you can hear this afternoon, that's what this afternoon, I'm so used to that, this morning, that's what somebody who's been saved lives like. Someone who understands their salvation. We move from a natural-born passion for self-exaltation and self-preservation to a new birth passion for self-denial and Christ exaltation. And that's what's, I believe, the main idea of this text today. The main idea is simple. one who has been freed by the gospel will joyfully lay down their freedom for the gospel. Let me say that again. One who has been freed by the gospel will joyfully lay down their freedoms for the gospel. You see that all throughout this text, don't you? What does he say there in verse 12? I will endure anything rather than get in the way of the gospel. He says it again in verse 16. Woe to me if I don't preach the gospel. And then you see it there in verse 23. I do it all for the sake of the gospel. He wanted desperately for this church that he had by God's grace planted to get that. And I believe by way of the inspiration of the Spirit, God wants us to get this. To imitate Paul, as he says in chapter 11, verse 1. Be imitators of me as I am of Christ. And what is it that they were to imitate? Being constrained, being consumed, being controlled by the gospel of Jesus Christ. So consumed, my friends, that the posture and the action of self-dying and self-denial is a natural outflow of our lives. Now really, I believe as we look at this chapter, we can split it up into two parts really cleanly. First, you have Paul's personal example of his own self-denial, his denial of his legitimate rights so as not to get in the way of the gospel. And then the last half of this, we see Paul's sort of personal ministry method of laying down himself and his potential comforts in order to contextualize the message to advance the gospel, right? So the first half, I'll do anything not to get in the way of the gospel. And the last half, I'll do anything to advance this gospel short of compromising the message. All right, so we're just going to look at the first half of that today, verses 1 through 18. And let's look right now at self-denial for the purpose of removing obstacles to the gospel. He's going to use himself as an example of this. But in order to do that, Paul's got to do a little work for us, right? He has to, first of all, establish that he does indeed have legitimate rights. It's not true self-denial if it's not a legitimate right that you're laying down. And so Paul begins by just throwing out his argument. Hey, here's who I am and here's the rights that I have. The very first phrase, am I not free? I mean, Paul begins in these first couple verses with the really general and moves to the specific here. And he begins with a really general statement. Guys, am I not free in Christ just like you? And the implied answer, of course, is yes, you're free. And so Paul is simply saying with that question there, I am as disposed to the Christian liberties that you have as you are. I can eat food if I want to. And yet, what do we know that he said at the end of chapter 8? If food makes my brother stumble, I'll never eat meat. Right? He was free from the encumbrances of the law, and yet we'll see at the end of this chapter next week, right, that when the circumstances called for it, he would kind of like go back into observing feasts and festivals and whatnot. Again, so long as he didn't compromise the gospel, he would lay that down in order to reach them. So we see that Paul had legitimate rights, first of all, just as a Christian that he chose to deny. But then Paul moves his argument to an even greater right that he had as an apostle. But before he did that, he had to clear up one more thing. And that's that he was indeed an apostle, right? He says, am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not my workmanship in the Lord? If to others I am not an apostle, at least I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. Now, I don't know about you, when I first read this, it sort of seems like Paul's being a little touchy about the topic here. You know? So why does he seem so defensive? Why does he feel the need to state and prove his apostleship? Well, first of all, that was absolutely necessary for his argument. If he's going to say, I've got these rights as an apostle, then he has to prove that he's an apostle, right? But also, it's apparent from the context here that there were some people in Corinth who were questioning Paul's apostleship, which meant that they were questioning his authority, and they were questioning his influence, and they were spreading that message to other people, which was damaging his ministry, was damaging his teaching, right? You can see that in verse 3. This is my defense to those who would examine me. So he's defending himself from those who would examine him. That word examine is the Greek word anakrino. It means to investigate in court, to interrogate, to question. Again, there's a group of people there in Corinth who were questioning Paul, questioning his authority and questioning his legitimacy. Now, of course, Paul is a human like all of us, and no leader on earth is above accountability. And yet, I think we can see the dangers here of being slanderous against God's leaders. It damages ministry. You discredit a man and his calling, you can discredit everything he's taught and done. So Paul wants to make clear right out of the gate here, yes, I am indeed an apostle, right? Now there were some criteria for those who were apostles. One of them was that an apostle had to have seen the risen Jesus with their own eyes. And they had to have received direct commission from the risen Christ. Which, by the way, a little side note, sort of eliminates anyone in today's context who would call themselves an apostle. There are a lot of kind of self-appointed apostles out there, and when you see that, just kind of look at that with a little critical eye, right? This is not a self-appointed term. Those people haven't seen the Lord. And that's probably, honestly, why some of them were questioning Paul, because he was unique, right? He wasn't one of the 12. He hadn't seen Jesus before his ascension in the post-resurrected Jesus. No, Paul hadn't done that. But he was unique in that he had seen the resurrected and ascended Lord right there on the road to Damascus in Acts chapter 9. We have plenty of other places where Jesus directly talked to Paul. He received direct revelation from Jesus himself. You see that in Acts chapter 22, verse 18, Acts 23, verse 11. I love the words of Ananias to Paul in Acts 22:14. He says to Paul, "The God of our fathers appointed you to know his will, to see the righteous one." This was God's appointment, that you would see the righteous one. There you go. That's one of the criteria for apostleship. So Paul solidifies his apostleship by saying, have I not seen the Lord? Answer, yes, you've seen the risen Lord. And secondly, Paul says, look at yourselves. The very planting of this church on these initial missionary endeavors here is evidence of my apostleship. Jesus has empowered me to do apostolic work, of which they represented. He says, look, even if other people question my apostleship, y'all shouldn't, right? You are the seal of my apostleship. And so having established his apostleship, he now moves into his arguments. That's a little foundational work here. And he wants them to see that there are very legitimate rights that he, as an apostle, had that he denied for the sake of the gospel. And namely, really the main one he's going to hone in on here is that he had the right to receive compensation for his work. He had the right to be paid to do ministry. His argument will be that he chose to deny that right. But he first, again, needed to prove that that was a legitimate claim. Because some may be saying, well, dude, don't you love the Lord? Shouldn't you just do this for free anyway? That's no right at all. And so Paul lays out his argument. Look at verses 4 and 6. He says, do we not have the right to eat and drink? Do we not have the right to take along a believing wife, or as do the other apostles and the brothers of the Lord and Cephas? Or is it only Barnabas and I who had no right to refrain from working for a living? So he says, don't we have the right to eat or drink? Now, I suppose we might go, well, I guess Paul is referring back to the question about eating in chapter 8 here. But the context seems to actually imply that this statement is more about provision to eat and drink. Don't we have the right to receive provisions? We're no different than the apostles, other apostles who eat and drink from the support of the church that they're pouring into. The statement there about bringing along a wife, well, that reminds us of a couple things. Paul's talked about marriage and singleness already, and man, it's amazing how Paul just sort of brings balance to that topic, right? He reminds us here that there are apostles who are married, right? And if we wanted to, that's a right that we could have as well, right? But again, I don't think that Paul's really trying to bring the marriage thing up here. I think this is more of a financial support issue. He's essentially saying, guys, we, just like the rest of them, we have a right not just for ourselves, but to be our whole family to be supported as we come and do ministry if we want, right? And you see that this is Paul's intention by that last kind of little phrase there in verse 6. Or is it just me and Barnabas who don't have the right to be paid? And it's an implied answer. Of course, it's not, you guys aren't an exception here. You have this right. But to drive it home, Paul begins to lay out several points as to why it's a legitimate right to receive, and even if he wanted to request pay from them. First, he just goes with that common logic argument here. Look at verse 7. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard without eating of any of its fruits? Or who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? He's like, guys, everybody, you don't have to be a Christian to get this concept, right? If you labor in something, then you are entitled to receive the fruits of that labor. A soldier doesn't enlist in the army and then go out and buy his own equipment and then pay his own way. You know what that does to a soldier? That makes him neglect his post, or it makes him steal from the people that he's supposed to be protecting from. It doesn't work that way. A gardener doesn't grow his vegetables and then go to the supermarket and buy the same vegetables he's grown. He eats from his own garden. The one who tends and cares for and shepherds the flock gets milk from those goats. Therefore, he says it's common logic. It proves that Paul's time spent working in the ministry could logically demand, just by the logic of the world, compensation. But then he goes on. He says, do I say these things on human authority? Does not the law say the very same? For it's written in the law of Moses, you shall not muzzle an ox when it treads out the grain. Is it for oxen that God is concerned? Does he not certainly speak for our sake? It is written for our sake, because the plowman should plow and the thresher thresh in hope of sharing in the crop. So Paul anticipates with that first little argument that some may go, okay, Paul, you're giving us the secular argument. We're not secular, we're the church. We don't think like the world. So Paul goes, okay, well, maybe you should know then that the Word of God says something about this too. And he takes them back to the Old Testament scriptures, Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4, where it said in the law, don't muzzle an ox while it's treading out the grain. Don't put a muzzle on an ox so that he can't stop and get something to eat while he's treading out the grain. In other words, don't starve the animal that's doing the work. Right? That's both logically sound and that's biblically founded. And Paul says, yeah, in some sense that command was given for the good of the ox. But don't you know that God actually wrote it for our instruction? Don't starve the hand that feeds you. Which is why he says in verse 11, if we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much if we reap material things from you? Guys, we labored among you. We gave of our time to study and preach and teach. We gave much effort, surely physically, mentally, and emotionally, caring for your spiritual well-being. Now, friends, you can ask any of the young guys and women who've been going through the Simeon Trust training. It's hard work. It's weighty labor handling God's Word. And I can tell you, soul care is hard, laborious work. And so, Paul's saying here, should we not expect to be taken care of by you guys for the ways that we've been pouring out among you? The implied answer, yes, of course. Next, he argues from their common practice. Look what he says. If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? So apparently there had been some other teachers who had come through. We know that Apollos had come through, and it seems like Cephas, that is Peter, had come through, and they had received financial support of the church when they ministered. So Paul's like, if they can rightfully receive pay, shouldn't we, who founded this church, be entitled to that? He further argues that this is just common practice among God's people. Look at verse 13. We'll come back to verse 12 in a minute. Verse 13. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple, and those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? Again, he says, just look at the pattern, God's pattern in the Old Testament. The priest in the temple ate from the temple sacrifices. That was their payment. Heck, we can even look outside the Old Testament. Look around you here in this pagan city of Corinth. We talked about that last week. The priests in the pagan temples ate from their sacrifices. And finally, just to drive it home, he goes, in the same way, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. Hey guys, if none of those arguments are compelling, this one should be. Jesus said it himself. And he's most likely here referring to the words of Christ in Luke chapter 10, verse 7, when he sent out the 72, and he says, you don't even need to take provisions. Eat what's laid before you by those that you're ministering to, for the laborer deserves his wages. So man, I mean, that's a thorough argument as to why the church ought to pay their pastors and pay those who are ministering to them in vocational ways, right? And he says, of me, of all people, as the apostle that planted this church, deserved and I could rightfully demand that of you. Now, let me just take an aside for a moment and just say that that's a really good mindset for churches to have. I got to be honest, those texts are really awkward for me to preach because I get paid by the church. And I just want you to know that that's not Paul's bullseye here. I'm really thankful for that because it kind of is awkward for me to preach that. But we ought to hear those arguments, and we ought to know that it's really not God's intention for His ministers to just try to figure out how to make it in life as they pour out for the service of the church. Bivocational ministry has its place. It's a special calling for some. Obviously, it was for Paul here, but that's more descriptive than prescriptive for how churches ought to think about supporting their pastors. And I just want to say to you, Aletheia, you guys have been great at this. From the time that this church was planted several years ago, I know I personally have my family, we've never not been able to pay our bills. We've always had food on our table, gas in our cars, we've been able to do things with our children. I'm just really thankful for the many of you in this body who understand that concept and take that seriously. And I pray that you do that well after I'm gone. For whoever's pastor the next, or if we bring on additional staff in the future, it's a good thing for churches to take care of their pastors. That's not wasted money ever. But again, that's not the point of Paul's passage. This isn't like a passage on paying pastors here. His point, right, is that I could very legitimately exercise that right and ask for pay, but I choose to lay that right down for the gospel. He's taking us all the way back to chapter 8, right? Think about this. The heart of chapter 8 was, that's an absolute legitimate right you had to eat that meat sacrificed to idols. Absolute legitimate right. But the legitimacy of your right does not necessarily mean that God might not call you to lay it down. I mean, the reality is, Paul had a greater concern than his rights. His greater concern was the gospel. And I wish we all thought this way. How many churches have been split in two and their witness is shattered in the context in which God had put them because people are fighting tooth and nail for their rights instead of fighting tooth and nail for the gospel. Now, let's be honest, most of the time those rights that we're fighting for are not nearly as legitimate as the one Paul uses here. I like hymns better. I like, rock music better. That's my right to have that preference, and I demand it. And people leave, and boom, the obstacles put in the way of the gospel, the witness of Christ destroyed. Or to use Paul's very personal example here, there are ministers out there who demand crazy compensation for the work that they do. It's likely that was happening in Corinth, right? That there might have been some itinerant preachers who came through. Certainly we know there were philosophers who had come through the city of Corinth who were notoriously greedy, and they would bleed the bank account of those that they were teaching. And unfortunately, guys, we see that same sort of greed, abuse happening in our world today. Yes, sometimes in the name of Jesus and in the name of gospel ministry. You would be appalled, absolutely appalled, if you knew what some preachers ask to come speak at an event or come speak at your church. I just curiously Googled the cost of a certain well-known prosperity gospel. I've chosen to refrain from throwing the name out there. But it was like $100,000 this person charged to come speak at your event. Friends, I got to say, when the world sees that, boom, that's a boulder in the path of the gospel. And Paul says, I won't do that. I will never be guilty of that. In fact, I will endure. You see that verse 12? I will endure anything not to put an obstacle in front of the gospel. I mean, that word endure tells you that his right of being compensated, that he laid down, wasn't a small thing. We may tend to think that's like a small thing, but it wasn't. His bivocational decision was not a minimal sacrifice. Listen, tent making, which is what Paul did, leather working, was hard, dirty, smelly, grueling work that he had to do through the night so that he can go teach in the middle of the day. I was reading about this, that some people believe it's very possible that Paul's hands and arms were permanently stained by the leather work that he did. He would come to this study stained and sore so that he wouldn't be an obstacle. Now, that word obstacle is a really interesting word. It's the word incope. It means to cut into. I love Leon Morris's comments here. He says, it means a cutting into, and it was used of breaking up a road to prevent the enemy's advance. Paul had avoided doing anything that might prevent a clear road to the gospel advance. You know, a hole in the road if you're trying to get something somewhere is a problem. I remember years ago when I was a young man, I was out with my brother doing that favorite of redneck pastimes, four-wheeling. You know, we're in a four-wheel drive truck, big old tires, and going mudding in the middle of the night. And we were coming home. We were out in the mountains, all right? We were coming home. We were on this dirt road, and all of a sudden, out of nowhere, my brother goes, "Oh, bleep," you fill in the blank. And I said, "What?" And then as soon as I said that, the front end of our truck went boom. There was this massive hole right there in the middle of the dirt road. Now, guys, this is before cell phones was a thing, all right? It was 1 o'clock in the morning. We didn't have a flashlight. And so we're out there digging around, trying to find rocks, and we got the jack out, and it took us like 3 hours to get out. It was a problem for us to get home that night. I thought about that when I thought about this word picture here. I wonder, friends, I just wonder where we might just be cutting a hole in the path of the gospel for the sake of my rights, keeping people from getting there. Maybe we rightly demand some certain treatment, but our anger in so expressing it blows a hole right in the road. Now, Paul, he was determined that he would do anything to make sure that was the only tripping point was the message itself. We're getting rained on here? Hallelujah. Well, we don't have any sound equipment.
My laptop.
Yeah, let's get that out of there. Amen. Hey, if it gets bad and you can't take it, then I don't know.
We can go into the main entrance.
Yeah, we'll figure it out here. It's all right, man. God's good. He's cooling us down. Guys, this was Paul's mindset. His rights, legitimate as they were not more important than the gospel that had forever changed his heart. And they were certainly not more important than the one who had saved him. I love David Pryor's statement here. He says Paul's whole autobiography would endorse that statement. He was passionately gripped by Jesus Christ. He would do literally anything to ensure that everything, in everything, he might be preeminent. His whole attitude to Christian ministry was to endure rather than enjoy his daily calling. Amen. What do you think, guys? Should we move?
It's coming down harder, Mike. It's coming down harder. Yeah, I'm working to just stay there.
Yeah, if you guys want to get under this, I can probably carry on here. Sorry.
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, that's the way the day's going.